It was a Tuesday morning, ordinary in every way. The coffee was still warm on the counter. The sun was doing that thing it does in early fall where it comes through the kitchen window at just the right angle and makes everything look a little more peaceful than it actually is. My wife had left for work about an hour earlier. I remember she had kissed me on the cheek, grabbed her keys, and said something about picking up dinner on the way home. Nothing remarkable, nothing out of place. That is the detail I keep coming back to. How completely normal that morning felt. I had been married for 12 years. 12 years to a woman I genuinely believed I knew better than I had ever known anyone in my life. We were not a dramatic couple. We did not have the kind of relationship built on passionate arguments and tearful reconciliations. We were steady. We were honest. Or at least, I thought we were. People used to say things like, "You two make it look easy," and I always took that as a compliment. I was proud of what we had built together. I was comfortable in it. Maybe a little too comfortable. Looking back, I think I had confused familiarity with understanding. We had tried to have children early in our marriage. It did not happen. The doctors were not unkind, but the news was difficult, and we had spent a few quiet years grieving something that never quite had a name. Eventually, we made peace with it, or at least we found a version of life that felt full without it. We traveled more. We invested in our friendships. We built a home together that felt like a real home. I had accepted that chapter as closed, so when the doorbell rang that Tuesday morning, I was not prepared for what was standing on the other side of it. I opened the door, and there was a boy. Small. Maybe 6 years old, maybe 7. He had a worn backpack on his shoulders, the kind that has been washed too many times and has started to fade at the edges. He was standing very still, and he looked up at me with calm, dark eyes and said, in a voice that was quiet but completely clear, "Is my mama home?" I did not speak for a moment. I just looked at him. He looked back at me without any anxiety, the way children sometimes do when they have been told something with enough certainty that they have no reason to doubt it. I crouched down so I was at his level. I asked him his name. He told me. I asked him where he lived, who had brought him here, and where his parents were. He did not have a lot of answers, but what he did have was a piece of paper. He reached into the front pocket of that little backpack and pulled out a folded sheet, the kind torn from a notepad. He handed it to me. It had our address on it, written in my wife's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. The way she loops the number 3. The way she writes the street name with that slight upward slant. I had read her handwriting on grocery lists and birthday cards and notes left on the kitchen counter for 12 years. I knew it the way you know a voice on the phone before the person has even said their name. I stood up slowly, and I felt something move through me that I did not have a word for. It was not anger. It was not even confusion. Not yet. It was more like a stillness. The kind that comes right before your brain decides it is ready to process something it does not yet understand. A slow, cold settling, somewhere deep in my chest. I looked down at the boy. He was waiting patiently. I told him to come inside. I got him a glass of water and sat him at the kitchen table, and then I picked up my phone and called my wife. She answered on the second ring, the way she usually does. I told her there was someone at the house asking for her. There was a pause. A small one, maybe 2 seconds, but I noticed it the way you notice a single wrong note in a song you have heard 100 times. Her voice changed, just slightly. She said she would be right home. She made a drive that should have taken 25 minutes in about 15. I know because I was watching the clock. The boy sat quietly at the kitchen table. I had given him a few crackers and he ate them without saying much. He was not distressed. He was not frightened. He had the calm of a child who had been told something specific and was simply waiting for it to be confirmed. I heard my wife's car in the driveway before I saw it, and then I heard the front door open and I watched her walk in, and the first thing I noticed was her hands. They were shaking, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone who did not know her well would catch, but I knew her hands. I had held them for 12 years. They were shaking. She walked past me without saying anything, and she went straight to the boy. She knelt down in front of him on the kitchen floor, and she held his face in both of her hands, and she looked at him the way, I do not know how to describe this exactly. the way only a mother looks at a child she has not seen in a very long time. There was recognition in it, not the recognition of someone you have recently met, something deeper, something that had clearly been there for years, waiting. I stepped back. I leaned against the hallway wall and I watched the two of them, and I felt, in a way I was not prepared for, like a stranger standing inside my own home. After a few minutes, she got up. She asked the boy gently to go sit in the living room for a little while. He nodded and went without any argument, and then she turned to look at me. I do not think I have ever experienced a silence quite like the one that existed between us in that hallway. It was not the silence of two people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of two people standing at the edge of something enormous, neither one certain how to take the first step. She spoke first, and she told me. There had been a relationship before we met. She was 19 years old. She had become pregnant. She was alone, she was frightened, and she made the decision to place the baby for adoption. She had believed, at the time, that it was the only choice available to her. She had carried that decision with her ever since. She had never told me. Not in 12 years. Not during the years when we were trying to have children of our own. Not during any of the thousands of conversations we had shared across all that time. I stood there, and I listened, and I did not interrupt her. And what I felt was not what I expected to feel. It was not rage. It was not the sharp heat of betrayal, at least not immediately. It was more like vertigo, like the floor beneath me had not collapsed, but had shifted very gently, just enough to make me uncertain where I was standing. Everything I had understood about my own life was technically still there, but its position had changed. When she stopped talking, I asked her one question. It was the only question I had the ability to form in that moment. I said, "Were you ever going to tell me?" She did not answer right away. She opened her mouth and then closed it again, and her silence told me more than an answer would have. I told her I needed a few minutes. I walked past her through the kitchen and out the side door into the driveway. I got in my car. I did not start it. I just sat there. At some point, I realized I was crying. I was not sure when it had started, and I sat with that for a while, trying to understand what exactly I was crying about. Betrayal, yes, that was part of it. But there was something else underneath it that I could not name cleanly. It felt like grief. For what? I was not entirely certain. For the version of my marriage I had believed in that morning. For the years she had carried something this heavy, without ever once reaching for my hand. I sat in that car for close to an hour. When I finally went back inside, the house was quiet. My wife was in the kitchen. I walked past her and I went to the living room, and there was the boy, asleep on the couch. He had taken his shoes off and lined them up neatly on the floor beside him, and his backpack was propped against the armrest. I stood there and looked at him for a long time, and something happened that I had not expected. I had expected to feel resentment when I looked at him, or at the very least, a kind of cold distance. He represented, after all, everything that had just been turned over in my life. But what I actually felt when I looked at that sleeping child was something much quieter and more complicated than resentment. It was sadness, a deep, aching sadness for him specifically. For a boy who had lost his adoptive mother, who had been handed a piece of paper with an address, and who had arrived at a stranger's door looking for something he deserved to have. Whatever was broken between me and my wife was our thing to carry. This child had not broken anything. My wife came and stood beside me. We both looked at him for a moment, and then we went and sat at the kitchen table, and she told me the rest of it. The adoptive mother had passed away a few months earlier. The boy's caseworker had found documentation in her belongings, letters, records, that eventually led back to my wife. The caseworker had made contact, had explained the situation, and had been working with my wife for several weeks to figure out the appropriate next steps. Several weeks. She had known about this for several weeks. I asked her why she had not told me. She said she'd been trying to find the right way. She said she'd been afraid. And then she said something that stayed with me. She said that every time she had come close to saying it, she had stopped because she could not stand the thought of losing what we had together. She said she had spent 12 years being terrified that this truth, if it ever surfaced, would take the only stable life she had ever managed to build. I asked her if she had a photograph of herself at 19. She went and got one from a box I had never seen opened. It was a small photo, a little worn at the corners. She was young in it, younger than I could quite connect to the person I had married, but her eyes were the same. I looked at that photograph for a long time, and I began, slowly, to understand something. There was a version of my wife's life that had existed long before I came into it, a version that had carried real pain, and she had carried that pain completely alone, not because she did not trust me, but because she had learned long before she ever met me that some things are too heavy to hand to someone else without believing they are strong enough to hold them. I did not forgive her in that moment. That would be too clean and it would not be true. But I made a decision. I decided not to leave the room. The days that followed were careful. That is the word I keep using when I try to describe them. Careful. Like every conversation was something fragile that we were passing back and forth between us, making sure not to grip it too tightly. All three of us had meals together at the kitchen table. We did not always talk much. Sometimes the boy would ask for something simple, more juice or another piece of bread, and those small requests were almost a relief because they gave us something straightforward to respond to. I started asking him small questions, not because I had decided anything about the future or about what role I was willing to play in his life. I asked because I was genuinely curious about him, his favorite color, what kind of food he liked, whether he preferred to be inside or outside. He answered carefully at first, the way children do when they are in an unfamiliar place and are not yet sure how safe it is to take up space. But slowly, he started to relax. My wife and I started seeing a counselor. We went twice a week at first. I want to be honest about what those sessions were like. They were not easy. They were not the kind of thing where you sit down and a professional says the right words and suddenly everything settles back into place. They were uncomfortable and slow, and sometimes I left feeling worse than when I had arrived. But something was happening in those rooms, even when it did not feel like it. We were learning, for the first time in our marriage, how to talk about the things that actually frightened us. One evening, about 2 weeks in, my wife broke down. Not quietly. She had been holding herself together with a great deal of effort, and that evening she stopped trying. She told me she had spent 12 years in fear. Fear that the truth would eventually find its way to the surface. Fear that when it did, it would cost her the life she had built. Fear that I would look at her differently, that I would stop seeing her as the person I had chosen. I waited until she had finished, and then I told her something that I had been trying to find words for since the afternoon in the hallway. I told her that secrets do not protect love. They only postpone the moment when love has to decide whether it is real or not. She looked at me for a long time after I said that. We began a process with a caseworker and with legal professionals to understand what the appropriate next steps were for the boy's situation. There were no simple answers. There were questions about guardianship and visitation and what was in his best interest, and none of it moved quickly. We were not rushing it. We were trying to be thoughtful, to make decisions that were right for him and not just for us. One evening, the boy had fallen asleep on the couch again, watching something on television. My wife and I were sitting on either side of him. At some point, she reached across and found my hand in the dark and held it. We did not speak. We sat there in the quiet for a long time, and I thought about what it means to actually know another person. I had believed for 12 years that I knew my wife completely. I had been certain of it in the comfortable, easy way that you are certain of things when you have not been tested. Sitting there in the dark, holding her hand, I understood for the first time that knowing someone is not something you finish. It is something you keep choosing to do. The morning before the doorbell rang, I was a person who was quietly proud of his marriage. Not arrogant about it, but settled, certain. I had believed that 12 years of shared life meant 12 years of complete understanding, and I had carried that belief the way you carry something you have never had reason to question. I do not carry it that way anymore. What the weeks after that Tuesday taught me is difficult to reduce to something simple, because it was not simple. It was layered and slow, and sometimes it hurt in ways I did not anticipate. But if I had to identify the one thing that shifted most inside me, it is this. The people we love most in the world are still fully capable of surprising us, not always in ways that are easy to receive, sometimes in ways that require us to sit in a car in a driveway for an hour, not knowing whether to go back inside or drive away. I went back inside. The legal situation is still ongoing. The counseling continues. There are mornings that are harder than others, mornings where I wake up and the weight of everything settles in before I have even had coffee. I am not going to tell you that we found our way back to exactly where we were before, because I am not sure that place exists anymore. But I am also not sure we are trying to get back there. I think we are trying to find somewhere new. There is one specific thing I want to tell you about, because it is the image I come back to most. One afternoon, the boy was sitting at the kitchen table by himself. He had found some paper and a few of the markers my wife keeps in a drawer, and he was drawing. He did not make a big deal of it. When he was done, he just left the picture on the counter and wandered off to find something else to do. I found it a little while later. It was a simple drawing the way children's drawings are simple. Bold lines, basic shapes, not much detail. There were 2 adults and a small figure in the middle. The 3 of them were standing in front of what was clearly meant to be a house. He had drawn a door. I stood in the kitchen holding that piece of paper for a long time. I did not know what to call what I felt. It was not happiness, not exactly. It was not sadness either. It was something in between that did not have a clean name. I set it back down on the counter very carefully. I no longer believe that loving someone means knowing everything about them. I believed that for a long time, and I was wrong. I think what love actually means is deciding to keep looking. Deciding that the person in front of you is worth understanding, even when the understanding is uncomfortable, even when it requires you to revise everything you thought you already knew. The front door of our house looks the same as it always did. Same color, same handle, same porch where a small boy stood on a Tuesday morning with a backpack and a piece of paper and a question none of us were prepared for. We leave it unlocked a little later in the evenings now. I thought I knew every corner of her heart. Turns out there was a room she had sealed shut a long time ago, and it took a small boy with a backpack to finally open it.